Hello, welcome. Good morning. 1 minute to 12. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining Dharma Sydney webinar. Just giving it a minute or two, reminding you that you're being recorded, and please use the Q&A function to ask any question throughout the webinar, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar, and we'll try to answer you during the webinar by typing in the answer if we can, or if it's content related, we'll leave them till the end of the webinar when Cameron finishes presenting. Please use the chat function to be interactive, basically.
Yeah, and welcome everyone. And while we are waiting, if you can enter in the chat, where you are joining us from, that will be great. Thank you.
I'll start with myself, Rona. So I'm based in Sydney. Melbourne. Hi, Adam. I've got a few cameras.
Yeah, it's great to see a nice turnout, and people are only increasing. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Lucky you, Henry. We've got pretty much all over as expected. Got a few Newcastles. They're pretty much all over. So not mostly from Sydney or over Australia. Do we have any international participants? A lot of times we do. Auckland, yes, finally. So shall I kick off the?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Great. So I'll do that by sharing my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Is everyone? Okay,
yeah.
Great. So welcome again. So this webinar is at 12 o'clock, lunchtime, obviously. So hopefully we get a good session here. We'll start with the acknowledgement of the country. Dharma Australia and Sydney branch acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So it's very exciting. We have Precisely presenting for us today. A bit about Precisely. They are a global leader in data integrity software, providing accuracy, consistency, and context in data for over 10,000 customers all over the world. So they specialize in data data quality, data integration, data governance, location intelligence, and data enrichment. So to find out more, simply go to precisely.com. They have 2 offices in Australia, Sydney and Brisbane. So feel free to explore. And joining us from States is Cameron Alden. He is the Vice President of Product Management in Precisely. So thank you, Cameron, for joining us today, for offering your time. Cameron is responsible for contributing to the growth, innovation, and go-to-market strategy for Precisely's product portfolio. So with over 20 years of experience, Cameron has a proven track of record building enterprise data products and communicating complex topics in ways that both business and technical teams understand. Cameron is also a requested speaker and author on product management, information strategy, artificial intelligence and data governance. So welcome, Cameron. If I let you take over the session, we will start the webinar now.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Rona. And I hope everyone's doing really well today. I'm going to get my slides up on my my screen here. As you can tell by the accent, I'm based in the States, but through the wonders of technology, it's great that I'm able to spend time with you all here. And as Rona had mentioned, my name is Cam Ogden. I'm a VP of Product Management at Precisely. We have a great session today, and we're going to be talking about how to build data governance programs that last, which I think data governance these days, we would all agree, is a must-have. It's no longer a nice-to-have. But building programs that last and can sustain themselves and constantly get people excited in the organization and get executives jazzed up about reinvesting in the organization for on a long-term basis, that's a different story. But we're going to spend some time talking through that today. And regardless if your role is in data governance or if you're more data quality focused, or maybe you're an individual contributor, or maybe you're not in data at all, that's okay. We will have a number of takeaways here that I think will be pretty helpful, and hopefully will be fun to learn as well. As Rona has mentioned, Precisely is a global software data and data advisory firm. We have a great team here in Australia with staff in Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne. And we also have a fantastic partner network that supports our team in our data integrity practice. So today's session, as I mentioned, will have something for everyone. I think that what you can expect as far as the session takeaways that we're going to be talking about today is how to build a program that links business goals to value. This is something that's fairly easy to say, but it's not always all that clear on how you would take your individual business objectives or goals and initiatives in an organization and directly link them to the capabilities in the program, so that the program really is essential and on the critical path to the organization achieving the business objectives. We're going to talk a lot about how to prioritize the data that matters in the organization and the data governance capabilities that matter as well. We're going to talk about how to communicate value across different stakeholder levels. Of course, a really critical aspect of any data program, whether it's analytics or quality or data management or data integration, is being able to evangelize and make sure that your message in your program resonates and connects with people in the organization based on what they're trying to achieve, not necessarily in what you're trying to achieve. So we're going to spend some time talking about how to communicate across the stakeholder levels. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is how to build engagement and trust, specifically with business teams, that really are essential to being a part of the data governance program in order for it to be successful. But it's not always clear for non-technical team members, what is the role that they play and why should they spend their valuable time with the data and analytic and technical parts in the organization so that it can be successful. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And what I want to do is I want to start with a typical governance story. And there are going to be several stories that I'm going to share through this presentation that are actual customer stories. So, you know, I personally have been involved with working with several hundred different organizations in building their data governance programs. Precisely as an institution, we've built, several hundred organizations as well. And we've seen what has worked and what hasn't worked in the big picture. Certainly over the last decade or so, as data governance has evolved from being a really niche and newer capability that bleeding edge organizations were adopting and delivering in the late 2000s into the early 2010s, to now today, where it's just, as I mentioned earlier, a critical part of the organization. The typical governance story that we've seen play out time and time again, though, and we've heard from organizations as we're just starting to get to work with them, is they've said to me as well, hey, Cam, you know, we've tried data governance before, and this is kind of what happens. This story might be familiar to some of you here. Whatever the inciting event is, there usually is some trigger around data governance. Perhaps it's the need to become more of an analytic-driven organization. Perhaps it's a compliance or a regulatory event. Perhaps it's an operational failure. Perhaps it's something within the organization that gets decision makers and leadership in the organization all fired up around the concept of data governance. And leadership says, you know, well, we need to govern our data. We need to get a data governance program in place. And so what they do is they invest in capital, and they either help to formalize the existing tribal knowledge. Perhaps there is a small team that already has been doing data governance on their own. But this program gets formalized, whether it's a net new or whether it's formalizing an existing smaller team. And this smaller team is pretty savvy. You know, they know that right away they need to get the business involved, because the business needs to own the data. They need to lend their input into what data is important, what data isn't critical, certainly the business rules, how the data is consumed, provided from a business process standpoint, and so on. And the business users, as they start to get engaged with the data governance team and to help with settling arguments around glossary terms and definitions, and lending their input into approval workflows, they start to wonder in the back of their heads at about 1 or 2 months in, you know, how does this really help me do my job? I understand that this is a big, important initiative that we have in the organization, but really what's in it for me? What they walk away with is they say, you know what? I know that I have a data firefighting team. So if it's not made exceptionally clear how data governance impacts their day-to-day work, and how the input that business user or business user community gives into the data governance program, how they're not going to get that back 2x or 5x. Essentially, they see the data governance team as a firefighting team. Okay, I get it. I can now go to you now for all my issues. And what happens is that this gets into a cycle where meetings get scheduled to debate terms and approval workflows and issues that are happening within data, with data in the organization. And ultimately, you know, what we've seen is that by about the 3rd or 4th month, the recurring data governance council meetings or the data stewardship meetings, where business user participation initially had started so high, it starts to dwindle and it starts to fall off as other priorities shift in the organization. And really what the business users are saying is, you know what, I was excited at first, but I'm not going to stick around and debate terms for 12 months, for the next 12 months out of the year, if I'm not seeing the return. And leadership ultimately looks back and they say, you know what, I'm not seeing the ROI either. And then they either deprioritize the program or they reallocate that capital somewhere else. So why is this so common? Why is this so common in terms of a governance story where there's a trigger, there's a lot of excitement for about 2 to 3 to maybe even 6 months, there's a lot of participation and engagement, but then it's so tough to retain interest over the long term. And what are the impacts? What are the impacts besides frustration and low morale, and certainly the risk to the reputation of the governance team? Well, some of the impacts that we've seen is, the truth of the matter is that 4 out of 5 governance programs fail. And by fail, what we mean is that they fail to achieve the initial business outcomes that were expected when the initial data governance business case was approved. So if you think back to that initial trigger, the whole reason why we're starting a data governance program, 4 out of 5 programs fail to hit that mark. Gartner found by interviewing over 300 companies a couple years ago. The Harvard Business Review says that 65% of data citizens don't know how data governance impacts their role. So implicitly, people know that data governance is important, but they fail to connect the dots on how it drives some sort of time savings or quality improvement or accelerates their day-to-day work for their specific role. And 74% of data leaders struggle to calculate the ROI of data governance projects. So even when we succeed, it's very difficult for us to specifically articulate what is the value of our program so that we can get reinvestment and expand and scale the program over the long term. So what we're going to talk about today is a business-first approach to data governance. And this approach has been used by real customers who have used these methods to get success. We're going to talk about a few of those examples as we go through the presentation today. Customers not only in our Australian market, but customers all across the world. So the great thing about this business first approach is it's not regional specific, it's not domain specific, and it really is not size or maturity specific either. We've worked with customers that have used this approach to obtain success with 3 people on a team or with 40 people on a team. So the scale and size does not matter. And this approach that we're going to discuss here is part of the reason why Forrester named us a leader in the latest data governance and analytics wave that just came out here in Q3 in 2021, which you can find out more about that report on our website. So first of all, let's get into the first step of the business first approach, which is how successful programs link data governance to business goals. And we talked about at the beginning around how this is fairly implicit, that we need to link the data governance objectives ultimately to the business objectives. Really, what does that mean? You know, when you think about data, and with the majority of us here being data professionals, at the end of the day, data is used for only a couple of reasons, but those reasons are very important. Number one, we work with data and we use data and we safeguard data ultimately to minimize risk. Minimize risk in failure of compliance and regulatory events. These can be things like data protection acts or KYC or fraud, data privacy, and some of the examples that you see here to the left. Second way that we use data is we use data to make decisions. You know, I think maybe 20 or 30 years ago, you could run the business on pad and paper in some parts of the organization, but that's no longer the case. Running a business today, if you ask any C-level leader in an organization or line of business leader, they're going to tell you that running a business is just about making decisions all day long. So what data do we have? Do we understand it? How do I act with it? And then what's the result after my action? So making decisions is an all-day, everyday activity for any organization in today's business. And then the third area is we use data to run the business from a business process perspective, as I think about operational excellence. And these business processes will be certainly respective to the industry that you're in, the business that you're in, but there are some processes that I think most of us share, such as being able to optimize the capital that we have on hand, working capital, being able to free up people and resources to do more with less. Improving the care of our customers. I think every organization in the world is trying to become more customer-centric as business in general is getting more and more competitive. If you're in the supply chain space, if you're producing products, there are initiatives around improving product traceability. If you're in the services space and you don't produce a product, but it's more around service, then you're thinking about increasing service levels. And these are all examples of operational excellence in which data is imperative to running critical processes in the organization. And when you think about it, though, what's interesting is even though the data, a specific data element might be stored in a specific location, it can be used for 1, 2, or 3 of these different silos. So let's take an example around customer account information. Customer account information that I might have in my organization has relevance for data protection, meaning that I want to make sure that I am safeguarding that information and protecting the data from a reporting, a compliance, and a risk perspective. That customer account information might also be used so that I can deliver more value to my customer by getting a better picture of who my customer is in a 360-degree view. And then that operational process that I might be deploying would be around enhancing customer care. So from a data governance perspective, this becomes really interesting because how do you make a decision around how the data needs to be cared for in a defensive capacity around data protection and negotiate that with how it could be used in an offensive capacity around getting a customer 360-degree view, and then ultimately identify how it needs to be used to streamline our business process to engage with customers more holistically and in a more streamlined way overall. So if I'm a data steward looking after customer information, this is a very real argument that I might have with my key stakeholders in a data governance meeting, where the compliance organization is thinking about data protection, the analytics organization wants to use it for customer sentiment analysis and getting a 360-degree view. And the business process team might not want you to touch it at all because it's too critical and too viable for customer care. And this next slide that I'm going to show you comes from an actual CPG organization that we worked with, where I know it's a bit of a busy slide, but I think if you look all the way to the left here, you're going to see some examples of how the data governance team started to unpack these business goals that they had. Think about the different organizational stakeholders in that second column from the left that owned each of these initiatives, started to have a conversation with them around the expected outcomes that they hope to achieve for those business goals. And then and only then, they use that as the context to frame their data governance objectives and capabilities as they formalize their program to the right. So this CPG organization, global CPG organization, was transforming their end-to-end sales processes, the product lifecycle management processes, and their BI and analytics teams to become more agile, more predictive, and centered on the customer. And if we were to just take this top example here on improving personalization of customer goods and services, it would make sense that from a data governance perspective, one of the first things that we might want to do is to establish a common view of trusted customer data assets. So we know that the marketing, sales, and financial organizations all have organizational stakeholder ownership, where they're looking at increasing Net Promoter Score, or NPS, by 5%. From the sales perspective, they're thinking about how do we increase our repeat customer purchasing behavior by 17%. And a financial organization might be looking at how do we reduce our customer churn by 11%. So the data governance organization, once they understood that those were the goals, those were the benchmarks, they started to align on establishing this common view of trusted customer data assets. And then that informed them that they needed to prioritize capabilities around establishing a data catalog, data lineage, setting up an approval workflow, and establishing data integrity rules and data quality rules. But they didn't just stop there. They went one step beyond that. And they had an interesting way on how they thought about data governance capabilities as being painkillers or vitamins. And one of the examples that the data governance director used as a part of her meetings with her business stakeholders is she said, you know what, when your knee is hurting or when your ankle is hurting, you don't want to go for a run. You don't want to go out for a walk. You're not focused on exercising and becoming fitter. You're just trying to become injury-free. You're just trying to get up to a standard level of health. And that's exactly what painkillers are. We need to first think about what are the must-haves in the organization before we can think about then actually getting healthier and taking the vitamins, which are the bonus capabilities. And far too often, a mistake that they learned from a previous deployment is they thought about capabilities as being bottom-up of what are all of the core solutioning and organizational and operating model capabilities that we would want to have in the organization, without any real line of sight of what are the data governance objectives that those capabilities are going to move at the end of the day. So once they had this lens, they started to look at what are the must-have painkillers that we need to put in place. Well, number one, we need to centralize our collection of customer data elements used for marketing and promotional campaigns. Number two, we need to set up a data lineage flow for upstream and downstream relationships across our core customer sources. They had a SQL data warehousing environment that ultimately provided data into a CRM space and then sent data into a cloud data warehousing platform, and then used Tableau to do reporting within this particular architectural framework. So they really focused on those sources and the critical data elements, and I'll get into a little bit more of that example here in a bit. You can see some of the other painkillers that are mentioned here on the slide. As a bonus, what they then found is that they could then start to overlay data profiling information to provide additional context on the volume and the count, location, and other contents of the data once they could get that centralized view. After they had their data lineage flow set up, they could start to do some impact analysis on what are the business processes and metrics and analytics that those data elements impacted. So you get the picture here. But we think all the way back to our business goal, improving personalization of customer goods and services. and the organizational stakeholders and the objectives that were important to those stakeholders. Once they had that, then the rest of the data governance capabilities started to fit into place. And they then just had to prioritize what are the absolute must-have capabilities if we are going to help our business meet these objectives within the next 12 weeks. And then from there, can we squeeze in any vitamins or bonuses from that perspective to help us get there faster? So our first takeaway here, our first of the four within the business first approach, is we need to be thinking about how to link the data governance program initiatives to higher level business goals, stakeholders, and business outcomes. And then once we've done that, we want to identify data governance capabilities that directly serve as both painkillers and vitamins if we have time to protect and grow the business. And that leads into our second topic, which is how do we prioritize the data that matters? So successful programs really think ruthlessly about how do we govern the data that matters, the critical data in the organization. And the truth is that not all data is created equal. So regardless of size and scale of the organization that you're with, the company or government institution that you're with, about 5% of the data that you have available to you within your organization drives about 95% of the business results. And data governance programs know that in order to be successful, you need to prioritize the critical data. And this gives you about a 5x faster time to value when you can really get focused on the critical data. And we're going to go through an example here. If we think back to our customer example on personalizing consumer and customer insights. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about what do we mean by focusing on what matters. So if you think about all the data, and let's just look at the bottom of the pyramid here. Think about all the data that's available in the organization. And let's just say that that's 100% of the data that's available. Now, we don't know what data is even out there. There's data that is dark data that's sitting in silos or spreadsheets or different sources and locations, and we don't even know where it is. But a subset of the data that we have on hand, we start to use it as information to run the business. So information that we ultimately end up codifying into business terms and into business glossaries, and we talk about them on a daily basis. So financial, vendor, material or product information, customer information that is really used to run our business. That's the information that we lift out of those data sources that we use on an everyday basis. And then a subset of that we use for KPIs or PPIs, performance measures, process performance indicators, and analytics. And then a subset of that are really the critical insights that we use to run the business on an everyday basis. And this really gets down to the core strategy on how the enterprise and the organization runs itself day to day. So if we think back to our example, let's say that we have an executive that wants to personalize our outreach to our customers, ultimately to reduce vendor churn or customer churn. So if we're thinking about customer data attributes, really at the end of the day, there are only about 50 or so common customer elements that are important in the organization that probably any of us on the phone here today or in this meeting work with if you're a customer data steward. And there are things like name and address information, market segmentation information, billing, accounts, and things of that nature. So what we want to do is if we're establishing this common view of trusted customer data, the goal isn't to capture all the data that we have in the organization. The goal is to figure out where does the top 50 sit? Where does it flow through the organization? How do we approve it and make sure that it's certified and trustworthy? How do we deploy data quality rules so that when we're looking at a customer ID and we can rationalize our customer information together, we know that Cameron Ogden sitting in one place is the same Cameron Ogden that might be sitting in another source. Or if I am going by my nickname of Cam, how do we know that that's the same person? And that's the starting basis on how we can begin to untangle how these top 50 customer attributes relate to our higher level business goal of improving personalization for consumer goods and services. And then beyond that, what we can do is that for each of our data elements, we can start to deploy data lineage characteristics where we can see where's the flow of this information in the organization. Now, I'm showing you some screenshots here from our Data 360 solution, but certainly the principle here applies, which is to get a central line of sight on what are the top critical elements that relate in the context of our business goal, and then where does that information originate from, where does it flow, and how does it impact various parts in the organization, so that ultimately I can establish a certain level of data quality trust, data integrity trust around the data that is being used for this particular business goal. So if you think back to our first tenet, which is aligning the business goal to the data governance capabilities, as we deploy these data governance capabilities, we're now going a layer deeper and we're uncovering what is the critical data, and then starting to deploy other tactics to look at where the data flows. Is the data trustworthy from a workflow perspective? And this really now enables me as a data governance role member on the team to engage with the business and say, look, we know that these are our top 50 customer critical data elements. I can see where it's coming and where it goes from the organization. I need your help with approving the creation or the update of this information anytime that it needs to perhaps be changed in the organization because it impacts our decisions, analytics, or certain business processes and how this information is maintained and stored. And this is essentially the same method that a financial services company that we work with used to shave 30% of their project time off by prioritizing their top 30 critical data elements around their consumer information. But beyond that, what they were able to do is then get line of sight into the metrics that they were using for KPIs and reporting on a monthly basis. And they were also able to shave off their month-end close time by about 22%. So prioritizing what matters allows you to get really, really simple and down to what is the critical data that's going to drive success for the organization. It also absolves us from the fact that, yes, while we might be getting more data every single day, and there might be new methods on how data is flowing in through the organization, whether it's streaming or whether it's IoT information, or if it's information coming in from on-prem sources or cloud sources, or whatever the case is, typically the most critical data elements remain the same. Customer account information, first name, last name, street addresses, account details, location information, things of that nature. So that helps to inform really specific conversations around our architectural patterns, but also how do we want to take care of the data from a data governance perspective and tie it back to the business. So our takeaways for the second section, when we talk about prioritizing data and the importance that it has in the organization, this saves time and incredible effort and prevents us from getting into the meeting cycles where we lose focus on the why are we having this meeting? How does it drive success against our common objective at the end of the day? And it also prevents the scale from getting out of control as, starting with 20 elements, then becomes 100 and then becomes 500. It doesn't become the case if we really think about what is the data that's needed to drive some sort of actionable insight by our organization at the end of the day, from a KPI, PPI, process metric, things of that nature. And then secondly, we talked about how we can establish ownership and visibility to critical data that impacts decision-making and then also compliance and risk. Think back to our 3 silos that we discussed earlier on how data is used to drive a compliance or a regulatory result, a decision, or used to run the business from an operational perspective. So now let's talk about how do we build engagement across the 3 levels. So if you think back so far, number 1, we've connected our data governance goals and our objectives and capabilities to the business objectives. So we're not going to the business trying to get them to care about data governance. We're bringing data governance to them in something that they're already invested in. Number 2, we're able to move fast by prioritizing on the data that really matters. And the third part of the approach is building engagement and building interest based on the stakeholder levels that are in the organization. And regardless of what industry you're in or what company or institution that you work for, you have strategic stakeholders, you have operational stakeholders, and you have tactical stakeholders. And at the risk of generalizing these different stakeholders, viewers, just go with me here for a moment. You know, there are strategic stakeholders that might make up executive leadership, and they're thinking about decisions on how to transform the business. So mergers and acquisitions, strategic programs, so thinking about top-down initiatives on how to become more secure around data privacy and protection. From the bottom up, on the tactical side, these stakeholders are focused on running the business. So they're thinking about how do we really safeguard the business? And they're thinking about how do we migrate data more efficiently and more effectively? How do we integrate data so that it's more streamlined and set up data pipelines that that reduce friction in the organization? How do we really deploy data science and engineering so that we can speed time to insight? And in the middle, there are operational stakeholders, and these folks are focused on growing the business. They're thinking about things like how do we get products to market faster? How do we engage with our customers more effectively? How do we identify who are the top 20 vendors, 20% vendors that we have in the organization so that we can get some more efficiencies with our suppliers and our vendors? What's interesting, though, is that each of these different stakeholders think about value differently. So one of the mistakes that our customers tell us is that initially, when they first started working on their data governance organization and before they engaged with us, they would just communicate data governance value in one way. They would talk about, you know, the data quality rules as an example that might get deployed, or they would talk about, you know, how complete the data is, or they would talk about how many KPIs were under governance. None of those things are wrong. So don't misunderstand me. None of those value metrics are wrong. But where the slip up comes into play is if you use the wrong value metric at the wrong level. So typically strategic level stakeholders in the organization, they're thinking about the value metrics that you see here in the top right. They're thinking about what's our process streamline efficiencies and our process enablement. What are the KPIs or PPIs that we're measuring and monitoring on our Tableau or Power BI dashboards that are shared by our executive leadership team? What's our project acceleration, and what's our risk rate if we don't hit our gateways around project acceleration? Conversely, on the tactical end, if we're working with a system implementation team or a data migration team, they're thinking about things that are very specific around volumes and counts and completeness and accessibility and the time it takes to curate data and the number of systems that are under management. In the middle, from an operational perspective, they're thinking about ultimately how viable is the data within the context of running my business process. So they're thinking about things like data quality metrics and accuracy and number of touches and data error rates. So the key thing is that as we are engaging with these stakeholders, and if you're in a data governance role or if you're in a data quality role right now, or if you're in a particular chair in your organization where you're having to engage with business and IT, you might recognize that the different metrics and conversations that you're having with organizations and stakeholders in the organization, that changes based on the room that you're in and based on who's in that room. And we need to be able to communicate value across these three different levels. The great thing is that data governance success can be communicated at any of these levels. So data governance doesn't just have to be communicated at the tactical level or at the operational or at the strategic level. We can use all three of these. And one of our customers, which is a global agricultural company, created something that they call as their value story based off of our approach. And this is part of their value story that I wanted to share with you. What their initiative was is that they stood up a data governance organization around procurement analytics and spend analytics for their vendors, for their suppliers. And the data governance organization rolled up to the chief procurement officer. And the chief procurement officer wanted to look at efficiencies on onboarding new vendors and identifying different vendor spend analytics. So as that was our customer's objective, they used the approach to deploy different data governance capabilities, aligned to that business objective, prioritize the data that mattered around vendor information and procurement. And then as they started to go to different organizational stakeholders in the company, they created something called a value story based off of our model. And what that value story looks like is they had some tactical value metrics that they put together, which we'll represent as the inputs. And they knew that the outcomes that their strategic decision makers wanted to see, that the chief procurement officer and his reports wanted to see, were things around like full-time employee productivity and data literacy, as far as how well can supplier information be understood by the organization, cycle time, data sharing, things like that. So what they did is they started to put together the story to connect the dots. And in their report out on progress, they used to start each of their meetings with their tactical value metrics and connect the dots to the strategic value metrics. So what they would say is they've said, you know what, executive leadership team, we're now at the point where we've cataloged 10,000 supplier data assets. We've defined the top 50 critical supplier terms. We've aligned on our key rules and policies for each. We've worked with your teams to deploy different data quality rules, and we're showing at 90+% accuracy and consistency for supplier spend data. As a result, our supplier data setup process has decreased by 25%. We're able to identify our top 20 vendors 33% faster, and we've increased our full-time employee productivity by 20% due to data self-service by establishing a data catalog. So what they did is they essentially connected the dots. They had a number of tactical value metrics that they had focused on within the first 12 weeks of deploying their program, but they knew that those tactical value metrics really weren't going to resonate until they connected them to the metrics on the bottom right. So regardless of who you're talking to in the organization, just remember what's the level that that ultimately those stakeholders are the most invested in. And this could certainly branch off into a whole separate tangent on how to communicate ROI and calculate ROI in the organization, which you can, certainly check out our website if you want to find more information there. But the takeaway here is that we need to be able to think about how we're communicating governance value across 3 levels: strategic, operational, and tactical. And then quantifying the business impact with value metrics that really resonate with each of those levels, not just 1 or 2, but ultimately how we can ladder up or ladder down based on the stakeholders that we're working with and partnering with in the organization. And this brings us to our last point that we're going to talk about today for the business first approach and how to build programs that last, which is successful programs embed governance in the business. And, when you think back to our typical governance story, the business, if it's not made clear to them after a while, what's their role in the mix, they're going to start to ask the question of what are these meetings and surveys and approvals and procedures and rules and term definitions? What is it really all about? And from a data governance perspective, we're left wondering, well, hey, why aren't people attending my meetings anymore? It's because they're getting frustrated, and data governance is a bit of a right or left turn for them if we're not embedding it in the business. So what our customers use is something called the bowling alley framework. And essentially what they're able to do is it's an easy method on how to get business teams to contribute and get engaged in the process, embed governance on their critical path, meaning on the business's path. We're not going to take them off of their normal tasks and activities in a given day to participate in our cause. We're going to embed governance in their daily workflows so that it almost is invisible to them. And this also means that we need to think about investing in tools that promote collaboration for all users, not just data experts, not just technical team members that know how to either write Python or SQL queries to go and fetch the data, but really low code or no code environments for data consumers that really mimic the websites and tools that we use on our nights and weekends and our free time. So what the bowling alley framework is almost think about a stakeholder or someone that you're working with in the organization today that maybe is not a part of your core team, but who you rely on in order to get the job done. And this could be someone who you're either informing of your progress, who sits within the business, or maybe you need some sort of expertise that they have, or someone in the organization that is participating but is not a part of your core team. At the launch, they have a set of goals as a part of their job role that they're responsible for. The responsibilities on their job description, and it likely is that helping with defining rules and policies and business terms is not a part of their job role. So what we need to be able to do is think about how do we make data governance invisible within the responsibilities that they do have. And there are a couple of things that we can do. Number one, we can think about how we set up bumpers. So, you know, when I used to go bowling as a kid, the bowling alley would have these bumpers that it would set up on both sides of the gutter so that it would almost be impossible for me to bowl a gutter ball. And this is very similar to what we want to do for our business users when we establish bumpers to make it easy for our business teams to participate. One bumper that we have in that our customers use is something called an engagement bumper. What an engagement bumper is it's things like personalized onboarding, establishing governance boot camps to help our business teams understand why data governance is important, establishing recurring newsletters, keeping data governance news and notes right you know, in the place where they go to get their news, whether it's the internet, the company portal, or perhaps in television screens, in walkways or hallways for those organizations that have gone back to work, or wherever that different news is disseminated. We have one customer within the financial markets that kicks off every meeting with a safety note and with a data governance note. So it's become part of being ingrained in the culture in the organization. Now on the other side, they have solution bumpers. So what solution bumpers are is really being around the tools and the capabilities that you deploy in the organization, thinking about how governance can be inserted at the point of consumption. So this could be where different business users go to access reports, or as they're going and fetching data, how do we make sure that we're putting policies in at the point of consumption so that they understand what data is being used for data protection and compliance regulations, or we embed access controls, certainly in the data that we are not allowing all organizational users to have access to, but they need to be authenticated to be able to access the data. Some other solution bumpers that are important is having a business-friendly user experience and a UI and providing targeted recommendations. So when data governance organizations that we work with think about capabilities and how they roll out those capabilities, this then informs what are the solutions that they're going to use. And they can start to chart out their program by thinking about the engagement and solution bumpers that embed data governance into the roles of the business users and the data consumers in the organization. And I want to give a couple more quick customer examples here before we wrap up. We worked with one a utility company that offered prizes for business users who could find a number of cataloged assets within the data catalog. We worked with another organization where in their data catalog, they had embedded governance rules and standards that overlaid on the reports that the business uses for month-end reporting. A high-tech company that we worked with offered prizes to create the best internal training video. So different business teams had to come up with internal training videos on why data governance was important. And they offered gift cards and days off to the most creative explainer video that could then be socialized and used to other business teams in the organization. And we worked with a pharmaceutical company that gave prizes and gift cards for every 20 standards or rules that got created or approved or operationalized. So these rules then got published to the company's data warehouse environment to manage access control, and users could also see the personally identifiable information elements. So these are all really creative examples on how to build engagement and how to embed data governance within the day-to-day business tasks. And ultimately, it's about clearing a path to your stakeholders' desired outcomes, making it easy for them to contribute to a strong data culture. So to wrap up here before I turn it back to Rona for Q&A, is let's recap. Number one, when we think about building data governance programs that last, we talked about linking the program to business goals, identifying the painkillers and the vitamins that are critical for first steps in the development of the organization. Number two, we talked about prioritizing the data that matters, really focusing on the top 5% that drives the other 95%. Number three, we talked about building engagement across 3 levels in the organization and codifying value metrics that resonate with each of those stakeholders in the company. And then number 4, we talked about how do we make it easy for our business users to embed data governance as a part of their everyday lives, both from an engagement perspective and from a solutioning or a tooling perspective. And we talked, at the beginning of the presentation, what can happen when a business first approach isn't taken. 4 out of 5 programs fail. We don't like to end on a negative note, so here are the positive results that we talked about with the customer examples that I had indicated through the course of this session. They're able to accelerate their program rollout by 18 to 40%, generate as much as 7x ROI, and increase the likelihood of reinvestment by 75%. So I hope that you've enjoyed this session and perhaps even had a takeaway or two, but at this point, would love to get some of your questions. And with that, Rona, I'll wrap up the presentation portion for today. If you want to find more information, you can visit this URL here, precisely.com/data governance. We have plenty more materials and demos and other materials that you can find there. So thanks so much. Rona, I'll stop my screen share and turn it back to you.
Sure, thank you. Definitely some very familiar stories, customer stories, and from my experience as well. So that was pretty insightful. Some of the ideas that you put forward, hopefully that will be beneficial to some of our participants as well. Varun, did you want to read out or do you want me to?
I can read it out. Thanks.
Sure.
So the first question, Cameron, is from Jess Kozman. Would you agree it is harder to communicate the value of data governance in asset-heavy industries as opposed to born digital organizations?
Well, I think certainly there probably is more of a challenge to communicate the value in asset-heavy industries. I don't think there's anything wrong with assuming that at all. I think part of the mind shift is that for asset-heavy industries, those organizations tend to place a premium or value on the products and ultimately, you know, the hard good or service that gets generated. And my comment there would be that, you know, today it's impossible to do that without trusted data, without high integrity data. And a component of that is making sure that the data is governed, is behaving well, and certainly has optimal health. So that would be where I would start the conversation for asset-heavy industries, is that in order for us to focus on our core business process or to reach a decision around getting a product to market, there are X amount of many decisions that need to be had in order to get there. That's the role of data governance. And the value of data governance is how we can either accelerate that or how we can improve decision-making by a certain percent. We would want to do some benchmarking to show a before and after, but that would certainly help to pave the way on how to communicate the value in an asset-heavy industry. Great question.
Thanks, Cameron. The next question is from Adam. Adam is asking, regarding business goals, how do you recommend dealing with customers who don't know what their goals are around their data?
Sure, you know, this is common. You know, it's not always all that clear what the business goal or initiative is. Luckily for us, data is at a place now where data tells a story. So if we're not getting feedback from the organization on what's important, or if we just don't have visibility to what the business strategic roadmap is, all we need to do is really observe what's happening with the data in the organization. How is it being used for reporting? How is it being accessed? You know, even databases capture logs, or they can, or if we have the right tooling and capabilities, we can see the logs and the queries and the filters and the parameters that are applied against the data. We can see what are the most important or most popular data sets in the organization. So that's one way to have the data tell the story, just from an architectural standpoint. We didn't talk much about the technical side in this part of the conversation, but the way on how data is stored and accessed and provisioned within most of our organizations today, it starts to tell the story and how it is used and how important it is. And we can start there to then infer, you know, why is this data used? How is it being used? Who is using it? And what is the insight that they're trying to get? I think starting with decisions is a great place, because ultimately, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, running a business today is about just making one decision after another. Certainly there's a risk and compliance angle and the operational aspect that are critical as well, but decisions run the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And trust goes a long way as well. You know, if you trust the data, if it is properly managed and governed, and you know you can trust the quality, then you can make better decisions. The next question is from an anonymous attendee. Do you provide the insights on education sector to implement the data governance?
Absolutely, yeah. We've worked with many education organizations, higher ed organizations. So, this approach works for higher ed and educational institutions. We've worked with universities and different colleges. Essentially, when you think about how do we look at enrollment, how do we look at student onboarding, how do we get insights around the demographic information that make up our institution, and how do we better serve them? Those are the same concepts that can be applied that we used within the presentation today. So certainly applicable to the education sector.
Thanks. The next question is from Rachel. When you are prioritizing data, you spoke about high value elements. Do you agree that prioritization of data sets themselves is also important?
100%. Yeah, I think, we start with the data element because typically those data elements, and by data element, I'll just make sure that we're all defining, or I'm defining a term when I use it. When I say data element, it could be something like customer first name. So a customer first name in that case, it could be Cameron, it could be Rona, it could be Varun in this case. And that information could be stored in many places in the organization. So one data element would have many different instances and certainly many different records that go within that data element. Looking after the data set that comes along with that data element is certainly part of the picture. So 100% the prioritization of the data sets that get aligned to the critical data is vitally important.
Just a couple of questions more. First is from Adele. Does data governance define system solutions? For example, data analytics solutions?
Yeah, data governance, we get a lot of questions from customers, and I've had folks also ask me, hey, Cam, what's the difference between data governance and data quality, or data governance and data analytics, or, pick your other market or capability. Data governance is really around defining the strategy of how the data needs to behave. If I were to just explain it to a family member who, is not in the data space that I might see over a holiday event, that is how I would explain it in its most simple terms. Now, many of you might argue with, the specifics of that definition, but it's really around defining a strategy of how the data needs to be cared for and behave in the organization. Part of that is how data is going to be accessed for insights and analytics. And that's when we talk about data analytics solutions. Now, data governance solutions can encompass things like policy management and stewardship management, and even data cataloging in some use cases. That's all up for debate on where the boundaries around data governance lie from a solution perspective. And each vendor, I think, will have their own point of view. But data governance at the end of the day is really around designing a strategy on how data needs to be cared for. And then the execution of that data is then when you talk about data management and data quality. The consumption of it from an insight perspective, a decision-making standpoint, that's when it starts to get to the data analytic level. So that's how we see it at Precisely, at least. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks. And of course, one leads to the other, and you provide oversight and guidance. And then when you execute it, that helps by providing the capabilities, base capabilities. So the last question is from Shri. Which model has been successful, hybrid or centralized, based on your experience?
Yeah, hybrid. I'll just give you a quick answer on that. They both have their benefits, but a hybrid model tends to be more successful. We've also seen federated models. I think the downside with the centralized model is that centralized models have a tough time with keeping up with just the pace of today's modern data organizations. We also talked about the fourth important point, which is embedding data governance within the business processes and practices. And the business runs at that hybrid level. So it is quite federated, it's quite decentralized. So that's a little bit of elaboration there, Sri, on the question, but hopefully I gave you a good, succinct answer there.
Thanks, Cameron. I think we are running out of time. So we'll end the question and answer session here. But if you want, you can reach out to admin at Dharma or Sydney Events at Dharma, and then we can take the questions to Cameron. Thanks, Cameron, and over to you, Rona.
Sure. Just a bit of housekeeping. Events and what's going on with Sydney's reopening. We are, at the moment, we're obviously still using online webinars to conduct our meetings and presentations, but at the same time, we are working with sponsors and presenters with the possible future in-person meetings. So we'll keep you updated. If you have any career opportunities, so whether you're a sponsor or presenter, please contact us and we will try to promote it through our channels. If you have any opinions and feedbacks at all, members, please just email us on this email address. If you're interested, or if your organization is interested in sponsorships, please contact us as well. Please join us. Every session we get asked, almost every session we get asked, how do we get access to a copy of the recording or copy of the slides? The slides are available usually within a few days from the membership section of the DAMA website. So it's definitely one of the key benefits of being a member. And recording is also available upon request. So please join us. And thank you for attending the webinar. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Rona for organizing this. Thanks Cameron and Stacey. Have a wonderful day ahead, Cameron. And stay safe. Yeah.
Stay safe. Thank you.